Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer, and this is interview number 71 in the series. My guest this week is Michael Hall, Dr. Michael Hall, Ph.D., who is a psychologist living in Binghamton, New York. And in just a second, I'll have Michael introduce himself in terms of a brief biographical sketch, and then we'll get into much greater detail. But I just wanted to mention, in case those listening don't make it to the end of the interview, that I just added a new page to the website yesterday, batgap.com, which is a list of all the upcoming interviews, so that you can see who's coming. You can submit questions to guests that I'll be interviewing, and maybe you'll think of new people that you'd like me to interview. So welcome, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
Yeah.
Thanks for talking with me.
Yeah, I've been listening to you as I do with most of my guests all week long, maybe 5 hours worth or so I've listened to. And I must say I feel a lot of affinity with the things you say, you know. It's like, not that my perspective on things is any sort of arbiter of truth, but for some reason a lot of the things you say just resonate with my experience and my understanding of things. So this won't be an argumentative interview in any case.
Oh, good. That's okay too, but
yeah.
Whatever.
So why don't we start by just, having you give us a brief sketch of who you are, what you do, just a paragraph or two, and then we'll flesh it out.
Yeah. Well, I'm a clinical psychologist, and so I'm not a spiritual teacher full time, although I do try to convey this understanding that emerges in me. It's been a long, slow process. I guess maybe it is for everybody, but you want a little background and biography, I guess. So, I went to college in the 60s, and I happened to read The Three Pillars of Zen when it first came out in 67. And by then, I'd already been searching in some way, although there wasn't a lot to do in the 60s because very few books were out. There was no YouTube. There was nothing. So I wound up reading things like the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and Evelyn Rose's book on mysticism, and just original sources is about all I could find. And then The Three Pillars of Zen by Roshi Philip Kapleau came out, and that was like, wow, this is happening right now. Actual Western people are practicing Zen Buddhism and coming to Kensho or awakening, and in fact it's happening in Rochester, New York, and so that gave me a lot of inspiration and hope. And then I went ahead and went to graduate school in clinical psychology at Indiana University and got a Ph.D. and wound up in Rochester doing a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship, and I think partly because I was aware of the Rochester Zen Center, and that was 73 to 75 I was there, but I was actually too shy and anxious to go to the Zen Center.
Huh.
So I walked around it every day.
Interesting.
I lived about 4 or 5 blocks from it, and I would go on these long walks every day and walk right by the Rochester Zen Center, and this went on for most of 2 years.
Huh.
I finally went to a one-day introductory talk there that Roshi Kapleau gave, and came away with a headache and not much else. Because they make you sit in this very rigid posture, and they hit you on the back with an oak stick, and it all seemed very difficult, and I was very tense and very anxious, and I was a new father, and anyway, I didn't really start to practice Zen Buddhism until I moved to Binghamton, New York, when I went to work at the University Counseling Center. There was my first real job, which I managed to avoid getting until I was in my late 20s. And I met a man there who was a psychology professor named Craig Twentyman, who was a very serious, hardcore Zen practitioner at Rochester. And he had created a very dedicated group of meditators there in Binghamton, and I started joining him. Like I'd go 6 to 8 in the morning, and I could walk to his house from my house in the snow, which it usually is snowing in Rochester and in Binghamton. But I actually did this, and I don't know why I did it. I just did it. And when I look back, I don't know why you don't, whatever you tell yourself is usually a story. So mostly you don't know why you do things. But I started sitting with this group on a regular basis, and I noticed very quickly that all kinds of psychosomatic symptoms I had at that point just started to disappear.
Hmm.
Um, Actually, for me, the most interesting thing is that every time I would sit, and we would sit for 2 hours in 35-minute rounds of sitting with 5 or 10 minutes of walking meditation in between, I would sit and suddenly I'd be aware of being very angry. And I hadn't been aware of that before I started sitting. But as soon as I'd go into the Zazen posture and start breathing and trying to, just pay attention to the breathing, I would be aware of being very angry. And this would last for about an hour.
Hmm.
In other words, it would last all the way through the first round of sitting, through the walking meditation, and then sometime in the second round of sitting, it would just sort of go away. And so that was interesting. And I also noticed that when I first started sitting, I had this lump in my throat, which I didn't know what it was, but I mean, now we just say it was a symptom of tension. But it quickly disappeared. And so these kind of things caught my eye and made me want to keep doing this. And
What were you doing during the actual sitting? Were you,
well,
what was the nature of the practice?
I had been to this one-day workshop at the Rochester Zen Center, and they taught counting your breaths.
Okay,
You
so
breathe
that's
in,
what you're doing.
breathe out two, breathe
Hmm.
in three, breathe out four, go to 10, start over.
Hmm.
That's what I was doing, just a basic counting practice. And over maybe 6 months, I noticed that gradually the anger thing would only last a few minutes, and then it wasn't there at all. I'd start to sit, and I wasn't angry, and I'd been told at that time also that I was borderline hypertensive.
Hmm.
My blood pressure was like 140 over 90, and I was thin and
And
pretty
you
fit and
and young.
and very young,
Yeah.
28 maybe, and so one day I was walking through the mall in Binghamton, and they had these automated blood pressure cuffs where you put I think 75 cents in it, and it takes your blood pressure, and
Hmm.
it was like 110 over 70 in the middle of the day, and I thought, well, that's interesting.
Huh.
And
Did
so
you have a tendency toward anger outside of meditation?
no, no, I don't think anybody would think of me as an angry person. I was always probably suppressed resentment and anger, even
Mm.
suppressed my own awareness of it.
And it didn't blow up every now and then. You were, yeah.
Never, no, no,
Huh.
no, no.
Interesting.
No, it's totally inhibited in that regard.
Hmm.
But like I said, I was someone who liked to please people, who wanted to get along, didn't like conflict, and probably would not have even known how irritated, resentful, and angry I was much of
Yeah.
the time. So, but I couldn't help but face it when I'm sitting there being still and can't move and can't distract myself.
Right.
So that's why I kept doing it, really. Stuff like that happened, these physiological things, and this went on for 4 or 5 years, and then interestingly, there's about 17 or 18 people in this group. They all got up and moved to Rochester except for me and Craig, and we just continued to sit there in Binghamton. And I went back into another one-day thing at Rochester, and but then my marriage ended, and I was living in this little apartment by myself, feeling miserable, and I had met Roshi Kapleau at that point, but I hadn't become a student of his, and I was reading in the Three Pillars of Zen, the Heart Sutra, and these lines: "Form is only emptiness, emptiness only form," and something just like that out of nowhere. I just went and laid down in my bed and laid in the dark and went into this really profound, I don't know, non-dual experience of a complete disappearance of the sense of me or any self-consciousness or any one at all, and yet there was this pure awareness that was just delightful.
Hmm.
And this went on for some unknown period of time, and then I fell asleep, woke up the next morning, and it was back to being me again. And didn't like that, of course, but knew something big had happened. So I called the Rochester Zen Center and said, "Can I talk to somebody about something?" And they put Bowden on the line. Bowden is now the abbot, the Roshi at Rochester, and he was very nice and said, "Well, I think you need to come and talk to Roshi Kapleau about this." So I did, and essentially at that point I began serious Zen training, going to first 2 day, then 4 day, then 7 day meditation retreats, and that was very instrumental. And then I had other different kinds of awakening experiences in these retreats, and then eventually Roshi sort of approved. And Zen, they have all these ways of testing the depth of your understanding, and sort of approved this understanding, just as Kensho, or what you might call an initial awakening. But
Hmm.
then I went on and did all these koans, hundreds of koans, these Zen puzzles, but I felt like after a couple of years of drama and excitement and all these experiences, everything went dry,
Hmm.
and I was still passing koans, but I had no clue what they really meant, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. So
How do
um,
you pass a koan? I mean, let's say somebody says, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" I mean,
you have to. It's not an intellectual. It's not conceptual. It's not. It's often not verbal.
right?
It has to occur like you have to in effect be it. You have to be the solution or the answer. And
And then you just know when you have got it. Is that a,
half the time you don't know,
oh,
but
but
you know it in retrospect. But the Roshi will see it immediately and say, "Okay, that's good. Go to the next one."
interesting. Huh.
Yeah. So it's a very dynamic, dramatic, intense, and brief kind of thing.
Hmm.
And then a real Zen teacher can often tell the minute you walk in the room in a private meeting if you've got it or not.
Huh.
And
They must be very perceptive.
very perceptive. And you're in a state, you're in in a retreat setting where all the senses are highly attuned. You're in total silence, and it's very intense and focused. So, I mean, the whole thing with the training there when I went there was to provoke awakening and create an optimal sort of setting for that. And it was rigorous and physically and emotionally grueling, but it did seem to succeed at doing that for a lot of people.
Hmm.
So, but then I went through, like I said, this dry spell, and I kind of my second wife got pregnant, had a miscarriage, and I had to cancel a 7 day retreat because I just didn't want to leave her, and I never went back
Hmm.
after that. So I was in the late, that's 88 maybe, and then I went through like 15 years of um, normal life, you could say, being a psychologist. We did have another baby in 1990, who's now 20, be 21, and so I raised my kids and worked, and
Were you still meditating during that time?
no,
Just
no,
just living
mostly
life.
just living life. I would say I gave up on the idea of what you might call continuous awakening.
Hmm.
I'd had these experiences, so I believe completely in you might say the truth of the teaching of Zen Buddhism, and but I thought I just wasn't going to have a chance to get further in this lifetime because I had to live like a normal life as a householder, um, and I wasn't going to abandon that. And I think that's kind of the implication there, that to really go as deep as you need to go, you have to be a monastic.
Yeah, at least in some traditions.
Yeah. So, I'd read about, people like, Huang Po or Wei Ning or, you know, Dogen or many of these Zen masters in ancient China and Japan who talked about much deeper levels of awakening than anything I could relate to, but I just didn't think that was in the cards for me. And so there was some kind of struggle with all of that, but I would say I gave up on it.
Hmm.
And then in 2002, for no reason whatsoever that I can identify, I'm sitting in my office and I had a book open in front of me by a guy named David Hawkins, and I think I might have been reading it, I don't know, and it just all of a sudden like that, everything fell away, and then that's never gone away.
Amazing. I mean, yeah,
Yeah,
it's interesting. I mean,
that's
you kind of like put it
totally
behind you. You hadn't been meditating or anything else, and all of a sudden, bingo.
right. I mean, maybe 5 years before that, I'd started a meditation group,
Hmm.
but that was like once a week for an hour.
Sporadic, yeah.
It was once a week for an hour, and I led that for 5 years. But it was just, I don't know what it was.
Hmm.
It didn't. It's just like I just like to do it. So that was. But no, I wasn't practicing. I wasn't doing anything. I was reading a book, and that's it. And I haven't
Yeah.
read that much about it either.
So when you say everything fell away, let's delve into that experience a little bit. What exactly happened or didn't happen?
You know, it's not that one wasn't an experience. I mean, the other ones were experiences, and they were
Right.
that I could tell you about them in detail, and they were dramatic and interesting. And
Hmm.
this one, I would say nothing happened. I mean, there was no experience. There was just a ceasing of something. It just stopped, and
What just stopped?
whatever this is, whatever I thought this was,
Whatever.
the,
Be
the
persnickety here. Whatever
this
you thought, what was?
I guess I put it in language as the sense of me, the sense of
Okay.
I, the sense of an identity that is continuous. That just stopped. It just ended.
So as of that moment, you have had no sense of me, I identity,
Well, I
or is it?
wouldn't say it in that absolute sense, but I'd say it nearly that clearly. And I've given a lot of thought and done a lot of work with trying to identify the moments that there is some seeming identity with the old programming and belief systems. And when that comes up, now it just jumps out at me. And I can sort of see it and catch it. And so that's become then my practice is
Hmm.
just these, I think they're called vasanas in the Hindu tradition,
Yeah,
these old
vasanas. Yeah.
vasanas, these deeply ingrained automatic patterns still arise, because there's
Hmm.
still the conditioning, there's still the ego, there's still as long as there's a body and there's life, there's this conditioning that continues. And I think a lot of it is universal. I mean, it's completely impersonal. It's not about me personally. It's just human beings are constantly being conditioned. And so, but yeah, there's no sense of an I at all.
Hmm.
It's never come back. And thank God. And I don't, it's like you have this sense of, I didn't do anything. I didn't earn, and then so then I immediately started talking about grace
Hmm.
because I was raised in a Christian tradition. I turned my back on it when I was 16 and never looked back. And but then when I went through this thing in 2002, I suddenly was very comfortable with the words of Christ. I went back and started reading the New Testament, and the meaning of some of these passages would just leap off the page at me, and it was lovely, beautiful stuff. And so, but it seemed like grace, just for no reason whatsoever, and undeserved,
Hmm.
eh, boom, you know.
Yeah, I mean, in listening to your talks over the last week, I heard you say that, you know, you give legitimacy to the idea of making efforts, doing practices, and so on,
Hmm.
but crossing of the final threshold doesn't come about through any sort of effort. It's
Right.
maybe it's the momentum that the cart has gained and it just coasts over the goal or something. But
Yeah. Yeah, maybe that's it. I think there's something to be said for a progressive, effortful, disciplined work at deconstructing the I,
hmm.
deconstructing the sense of who you are. And I mean, I think that's valuable. It certainly increases the level of comfort and enjoyment in life. It makes you far easier to get along with, and you don't have you don't have as much of a negative reaction to other people. And
Hmm.
but this final step cannot be taken by anything that could possibly be called you.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, the way I say is the ego can't surrender itself.
Right. It's like
So.
picking yourself up by your own bootstraps or something.
Right. It's worth making the effort to pay attention and to lose interest in yourself.
Hmm.
But, and I do think maybe that event, it's like clearing out this underbrush and this thicket. And I think over time there is a progressive, maybe silence or presence that emerges. Um, but awakening itself happens of its own in some way that to me appears mysterious, and I don't know why, but I did a lot of stuff that I thought probably helped.
I think it was Suzuki Roshi who said, awakening may be an accident, but spiritual practice makes you accident prone.
Yeah. I think that's a good way of saying it. Certainly in the Zen tradition, there's a tremendous emphasis on work, hard work, and responsibility, and commitment and discipline. I mean, these are words that people don't like to hear. They like to just think, well, it just happens. When I first started teaching, I kind of emphasized the grace end of it. And then I realized people misunderstood that to mean they don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
They can
Well,
just sit there and it hits them like lightning or something.
right, but then it doesn't.
Mm.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of teachers and speakers out there who are saying just that.
I know.
In
I
fact,
know.
they're sort of emphasizing don't seek. Seeking is an obstacle. Give it up. And to me,
Yeah.
that's like a guy standing on a mountaintop describing his surroundings, saying don't climb.
Right, right. That's exactly,
The view is beautiful. Don't
right,
bother climbing.
right, right, exactly. I mean, the way I look at it is you have to seek like a mad dog. In Zen, they say it's like you have to practice like your hair is on fire, um, until it gives itself up. I mean, and but it's to me another way of saying is like as long as the ego is sort of succeeding in its goals, you don't give up at the level you have to give up
Mhm.
to die in this way. But if the ego is banging its head against a wall as hard as it can over and over again and doesn't get anywhere really, then at some point it might just fall over and drop dead and be done with it. And that's called awakening,
Mhm.
you know, a total surrender. And people then think, well, I'm going to surrender. Well, you can't surrender. You can't surrender at this level deliberately and consciously and willfully. It has to be involuntary. And there's lots of ways maybe of getting there. And it doesn't have to be what you call a spiritual practice. There are people, I would say people like Eckhart Tolle and Byron Katie, their practice was being profoundly depressed for
Mhm.
years and years and years until they just couldn't stand it anymore and then gave up involuntarily and something snapped. And certainly there are people
But you
who've
can't
been,
make a practice out of that
well,
exactly.
I'm not recommending it,
No.
but I see people who do it all the time.
Yeah.
Or addictions are the similar, people who like David Hawkins and others who've just
Mhm.
been out of control addicts. But it's not a recommended practice. But I took the route of a recognized spiritual discipline that seemed to work for me immediately in some ways, and so I just kept at it. And I can't even, I don't take any credit for that. It just seemed to happen that way. But I'm glad it did.
Well, I think maybe as a psychologist, you would certainly understand that, or anyone would understand that, conditioning is a real thing, and the
Hmm.
vast majority of humanity are deeply conditioned and deeply sort of ingrained and entrenched in
Right.
habitual ways of seeing and thinking and behaving and so on, and you know all of that, layers and layers and layers of that, and I'm sure there's a physiological component too. It's not
Hmm.
just psychological.
Right.
It really has the tendency to occlude any sort of clarity of awareness. It
Right.
just gets covered over in layers of mud,
That's
and
right.
you have to remove those layers.
Right.
And
And that,
that's what spiritual practice will do. And it might seem absurd in a way. It's like a man standing in the middle of a mud puddle, and he says, "How do I get out of here?" And somebody outside the mud puddle says, "Well, take a step." And he says, "Well, you're asking me to put my foot in the mud again." He says, "Yeah, yeah, okay, but you do that enough times, you get to the edge of the mud puddle, and then you're out."
right. Right. Yeah, to me, I call it the practice before and after awakening, and it's the same practice that it's paying attention to these habitual, chronic, automatic beliefs and assumptions about reality that take over and then lead to, crazy thinking and behaving and it's certainly to me a myth that awakening completely clears the deck of all of this stuff. It doesn't. I mean, for me personally, a lot of it just disappeared in smoke with this
Hmm.
last awakening, but some things didn't, and they're deeply conditioned and automatic, and they come up over and over and over, and you have to work at seeing them, and understanding them and not buying into them and releasing them. And that practice can be taught to people, and I teach it to people all day in my office. And with or without awakening, I'm beginning to more like de-emphasize this awakening thing altogether because, I mean, it's wonderful, it's important, but the goal here, I think, is to become an actual mature adult human being who makes a contribution to the world and isn't a jerk. Uh, and you can do that without awakening. Uh,
Yeah,
and
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 there's
you
some people who supposedly were awakened who didn't quite do that, who behaved
abs
like jerks.
absolutely, there's lots of that. And the more you know the spiritual marketplace, the more you're aware of it. And I don't want to seem critical or judgmental. It's just a fact. It's reality, and you can see it in yourself. You don't have to go
Hmm.
looking at other people. You can
Right.
see, I can still be irritating and selfish and blah blah blah. And I think with awakening, you have a chance to catch it.
Yeah.
Whereas without some level of awakening or deep practice, it's so quick and automatic and it just grabs you by the throat. You don't even know it.
You don't even know you're grabbed.
Right,
Right.
exactly.
Now, people might find it a little puzzling because, a few minutes ago you were saying, well, any sense of a personal identity evaporated, and yet now you just in the last sentence you said, I can be selfish and irritating and all that stuff. And
Right.
so, the question naturally comes, well, who is selfish if all sense of
At,
a personal identity has
at,
vanished?
at the moment of being selfish, there is a perception, you could say, of an I.
Uh-huh.
Underneath that, there is no I in there, but you have to remember that. You have to remember the underneath it part.
I see.
Uh,
Do
and
you
and
do you have to remember it through some act through some volition, through some act of attention, or does it?
yeah, I think so. I think
Hmm.
that you have to usually in my experience, the normal uh, way life is lived, this isn't happening. This addictive compulsive behavior. And then when it starts up, it's such a dramatic shift that it's noticed immediately. And there's almost no real effort involved in not pursuing it.
Hmm.
But sometimes this conditioning is powerful. I mean,
Hmm.
it can sort of grab you, and you can almost get lost in it briefly. I would say with a deep awakening that's real, where there's this continuous underlying awareness, you don't get lost for long, and you have the chance to catch it very quickly. Yeah, but there's sometimes a deliberate effort involved in noticing and not buying into it. Um, so I don't know that I would say there's an I that's doing it, but the programming and the conditioning sure would look like there's an I because it's like, but some of this stuff is physiological.
Yeah,
It's not, it
sure.
doesn't even have a cognitive component to it at all. It's like the body is just reacting.
Hmm.
We're all deeply programmed,
We
everyone.
are.
And you don't wake up enough to completely diffuse the programming. You have to keep working at diffusing it.
There's a saying in the Indian literature that, talking about conditioning, that a sort of a deeply conditioned person is like stone, and you can make a mark in the stone,
Mhm.
and the mark stays there. And then less conditioned, maybe you're like sand, so you make a mark, and it goes away pretty quickly.
Right,
Less conditioned is like water. Less conditioned is like air.
right, right, right.
And extending that analogy, it's interesting to note that you can make deeper marks in the softer substances,
Mm.
which would mean you could have actually a richer experience if you're less conditioned, and
Mhm.
yet and fuller experience, and yet it's not indelible. It just sort of dissolves
Right,
again
right.
quickly.
It comes and goes very quickly.
Yeah.
And, there's an interesting idea that I mean, realizations and revelations continue continuously for me. I mean, and I think they do for anybody. But, I heard Jill Taylor talk. She had this wonderful video, My Stroke of Insight. And
Right.
at some point she said, feelings normally will come and go in about 90 seconds if you let them. And so, I took this idea and I teach it all the time. And if you don't construct a story about it in your head, in other words, blaming somebody else for why you're feeling the way you're feeling, or if you don't feel entitled to feel this way and you don't keep rehashing something that keeps it going, and you don't resist the feeling. You don't suppress it, deny it, ignore it. It comes up, you feel it, and it's gone.
Right.
And I don't know that I can say it's always 90 seconds, 60 seconds, but it doesn't have to be hours and it doesn't have to be days and years. It can be really very brief. But yeah, I mean, the more unconditioned this this body mind, um, there's no buffers. Everything is just immediately felt and experienced, and um, the goal is to not buy into the story that we tell ourselves or the belief that we shouldn't feel something.
Yeah.
And so as a psychologist, I spend a lot of my time trying to teach these ideas to people.
Hmm.
And they can get it, and it's an educational process. And with or without awakening, people become much more free and contented, happy, spontaneous, real.
I've heard you quote Byron Katie a number of times in your talks, and she's that's what she's all about, is enabling people to not take their thoughts so seriously and to
Right,
turn around whatever conviction they cling to, and
right, right,
just kind of let go of it. And
right, right. I believe that this is a practice that can be taught, and I mean, it's just observing your mind,
yeah.
and you can do it anywhere, anytime. Certainly silent seating meditation or some other formal practice is beneficial, I think, but you can do this anywhere, anytime. This is my practice, I guess I would say, if I have a practice now, it's just awareness.
Hmm. Though I sometimes think of this whole thing as being like, you can move a table by pulling any of its legs, and like that, you can. There are a number of things you can do which will sort of bring everything else along in your life.
Hmm.
You can learn to change the way you think, like Byron Katie teaches people, and that changes all kinds of
Hmm.
other things. Or you can sit and meditate, which is
Hmm.
entirely different process, and yet that changes all kinds of other things.
Hmm. Hmm.
And none of these things is mutually exclusive. I mean, you can do several of them, and it's like
Right,
pulling a couple legs at once on the table.
right. And
Um,
there's some kind of affinity that people are just drawn to certain things. And so I encourage people to do what they're drawn to do.
yeah,
And
yeah.
for me, sitting meditation was a very powerful draw.
Yeah,
Uh,
it has been for me too. I mean, I've been doing it for 40 something years, and it just always felt right to me, and it's always worked. So
yeah,
what the heck?
why not do it?
Yeah.
Well,
Um,
but other people, I've met people who, and I'm have very close relationships with people who are, I would say, deeply awake, who've never meditated
yeah, exactly.
and don't have any interest in it and wouldn't do it if you put a gun to their head.
Or people like yourself who did it for years, then stopped doing it, and then had an awakening.
Right, right,
You know.
right.
So you really can't get a pat formula. There's so many different ways that it
That's
shows
right.
up.
That's right. There's no formulas, but it is important to do something.
Yeah, yeah.
Somehow you have to. In the Buddhist tradition, it's important to hear the Dharma. It's important to hear the truth or an accurate teaching from somebody who can be that truth, and then something sinks in somehow, and then learning to listen to yourself, and learning to listen to your inner sense of what you need to do, and to tell the difference between the conditioned, programmed, ego-based beliefs and some other more direct knowing that says,
Hmm.
go do this.
There's a verse in the Gita which goes, because one can perform it, one's own dharma, though lesser in merit, is better than the dharma of another. Better is death in one's own dharma. The dharma of another brings danger. And
That's right.
it's a good one on this point, because I mean, you can hear somebody talking about their practice or what works for them, and you can think, okay, I'm going to try to do that, and then you can end up being totally frustrated because
Right.
it's not appropriate for you, and it's not going to work for you, and maybe it'll work for you 10 years down the line, but right now something else is actually going to be much more effective.
Absolutely. That's absolutely the truth. I mean, that's why, it's like just because, first off, you don't really know what worked even for you.
Right.
It seems like certain things work, but you don't know for sure. But it's really hard to tell other people what they should be doing.
Yeah, yeah.
I can suggest things that work for me and that I've seen work for other people, and you can try it out and see if it helps you. But it's really empirical, and it's learning to trust some inner knowing in you that says you need to do this or do that.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, I taught TM for 25 years, and for much of that time, my attitude was, well, this is the best thing, and this is more effective than everything else, and
Hmm.
everybody should really be doing this. And if they're not doing this, they're kind of like, wasting their time or whatever.
Right,
And, and
right.
I have a completely opposite attitude now. I just sort of feel like, who am I to say what's right for people? If they want to chant Hare Krishna or be a fundamentalist Christian or whatever they want to do, that's perfect for them at that time. And if it
Right.
isn't, they'll get interested in something else.
That's such a easier way to be in the world, isn't it?
Yeah.
To not feel like you're supposed to know what everybody else needs. What a relief.
Yeah.
And then any sense of judgment goes away too. But yeah, until this last thing in 2002 happened to me, I thought you had to be a Zen Buddhist, and you had
Hmm.
to do zazen, sitting meditation, go to retreats, and probably be a monastic, and
Yeah.
because that seemed to be what had worked for me, and oh, none of that's true.
I was
And
thinking about, go ahead.
no, I'd say unless it is for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if it's true for
Exactly.
you, then that's what you got to do. But that's not going to be true for hardly anybody.
Remember Sly and the Family Stone, different strokes for different
Yeah, right,
folks.
right, right.
um, I was thinking about your 2002 thing, and would it be fair to say, would this be an accurate way of describing what happened, which was that before that juncture point, your predominant, identity was Michael Hall, individual, with
Hmm.
occasional glimpses of universality.
Right, right.
And then what happened was when the shift happened, your predominant identity was universality with occasional upcroppings of Michael Hall,
Yeah, yeah, that's a good description. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's absolutely right. And the universality never really goes away. I mean, it might be less prominent at different times, but it's always there.
Yeah.
There's something very deeply biological about it. I don't know what, but everything just feels different. Being
Hmm.
in this body, being everything is just different in some fundamental way. I mean, when this happened, I just was, you just blurt all these things out that most people don't want to hear. But one of the things I blurted out was that my DNA is different. I was like,
It
and
might be.
I think it has to be. Something is really deeply biological about it.
Well, I mean, mind and body are interrelated, and I bet you if you had been really thoroughly studied in every way before that awakening, and now you're really thoroughly studied now, they'd see
Mhm.
all kinds of differences in your
Right.
brain waves and your blood chemistry and all kinds of
I
things.
I really think so. In fact, here one of my own observations here of mine was, that period between what I would say was the first real awakening in like 82 and this continuous thing in 2002, that whole period I now look at as, I think it's what John of the Cross meant by the dark night.
Hmm.
And or another way of saying is it's a period from the first experiential awareness of the kingdom of heaven and the continuous dwelling in it. And so what happens is you have this sudden awareness of the presence of God in all things, and then of course that leaves, and you go back to being you, and you try to do what you thought worked to get you there to begin with, and it never works because it wasn't you that did it. And then you go through this long, tedious, difficult process of trying to get back to the Garden of Eden, and nothing works. But I think that's what he meant by the dark night. And I also think that that whole process is a biological transformation.
Yeah, yeah.
It has to go its own way in its own time and can't really probably be hurried very much. And you don't know that's what's going on at the time. I sure didn't know. I thought nothing was happening. I was just stuck and that was the end of it. But I'd now say there was this deep transformation that was going on that whole time, kind of its own, just working its way through this biological body, mind, etheric, psychic, physical, emotional body. And
I
once it
think
was done, it was done.
I think there's really something to that. I mean, and not only on levels that, modern neurophysiologists could measure, but also all the traditional esoteric stuff
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
chakras and shushumna and all that
Hmm.
stuff. I'm
Hmm.
sure that there's all kinds of nadis being
Right,
cleared and all that
right,
kind of business. It's
right,
just
right.
another way of explaining it.
Yeah, I think, so went back and certainly I read the Kundalini literature and Kundalini awakenings, and I think there's a lot to all this. This is deeply, all I can say is this is deeply biological. This is not just a shift in perspective. This, although it's certainly that, you can't go back if you tried. I mean,
Yeah.
something is just, I don't know, a hole has been created or burned out or disappeared or something.
Body is the temple of the soul.
Yeah.
And if and I think this dark night thing is interesting. I was thinking about that perhaps during the week as I was listening to you. It's different for different people, and it's like we were saying with practices, one shouldn't jump to the conclusion that one's own dark night has to be the same
Right.
as St. John of the Cross or
Right.
something.
Right. Right.
Everybody's going to go through different stuff, but I mean, what's happening is there's this inner transformation,
Mm.
and depending on what kind of garbage you have in your house, it's going to look different, for different
Right.
people. Some people might
Absolutely.
get really crazy. Some people might get depressed. Some people
Right.
might all kinds of things. Some people might become megalomaniacal.
Yes.
Um, you
Uh,
know,
It's interesting. I see more and more the kinds of psychological problems, and especially these kind of radical falling apart of people's lives, that
mm,
I'm seeing. I'm getting emails from all over the world about people who are on this path and have had some kind of glimpse, and it seems like their life is completely falling apart. They can't go to work, and they don't want to go to work, and their relationships are. I see all of that as part of this dark night now. It's just some kind of radical reorienting of
yeah,
this whole being that is tough. And I guess I would say for me, I felt I had minor versions of that, but I didn't seem to have to become homeless. And that's, you know, I guess that's good. But I have seen people who did become homeless, and
hmm
that's just part of the process that there's some willingness to ride this out wherever it takes you.
yeah, and uh, and not everybody has the sort of the liberty to sort of sit on a park bench like
No,
Eckhart
no,
Tolle.
all
Some
right,
people have
all right.
kids to feed and stuff like that. But
Well,
I,
that was me. Yeah.
yeah, I think there are things you can do though to ameliorate it. I mean, there are purificatory things. There's yoga. There's dietary things. There's all sorts of things you can do to sort of because as you're saying, it's a physiological transformation
Yeah.
taking place, and
Yeah.
there's stuff you can do to facilitate and smooth that out. I mean, Ayurveda, all kinds of things.
Yeah, I think I help people do that in my office all the time. It's like, and it's but for people who are outside of any tradition and don't have any kind of teacher
Oh
and are
yeah.
really on their own, it can look really messy.
Yeah. Well, you talked about Suzanne Siegel. I mean, I both have read her book. I mean, she had a tradition, but she kind of walked away from it, and then
Hmm.
had this sudden awakening and didn't know what the heck had happened to her, and
Right.
lived in fear for 10 years.
Right. That's a wonderful book and a great story and kind of an appalling indictment of a lot of psychotherapy also. As a
Yeah.
psychotherapist, I read that book and kept cringing the whole time, but at the same time, I couldn't put it down. And thankfully, this guy was editor of Yoga Journal, I guess.
Stephen Bodian
Stephen Bodian
he
finally.
sent her to Jean Klein. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. He said, "Look, you've had an awakening. Go talk to this guy."
Yeah.
And I immediately had this sense of what John Klein probably said to her, which was essentially, your thinking mind, your ego continues after the most radical awakening. You just don't need to take it seriously or pay any attention to it.
Yeah. She
Uh,
was also continuously looking back, trying to find that sense of personal identity
right,
that she felt she had lost. And he
right,
said, he said, stop looking back.
right.
Stop,
Yeah.
stop
Just,
looking for it.
just stop doing that. You can't go back.
Yeah.
That's gone.
Hmm.
Yeah. If you try to go back, you're going to feel, like there's something wrong with you because that's gone.
The book we're referring to, by the way, for people who are listening to this, is called Collision with the Infinite by Suzanne Siegel. I have a link to it on batgap.com if you want to check it out. Good one. There's also been a few interviews I've done with people who had really dramatic Kundalini awakenings. There's one is a woman named Sarojini, which you'll find on Batgap, and another is Siddhananda. They both adopted Indian names after they got with their guru. But boy, the stuff they went through. And the first one, Sarojini, she was just like this housewife in Arizona, and she didn't know anything about spirituality. She had never thought about it, and woke up one morning with this sort of strange energy going on,
Mm-hmm.
and it just started to go like a volcano, and she thought she was going crazy, and she started doing research, and she thought she had Kundalini disease when when she first looked up the term, and went
Right.
through all kinds of rigmaroles until she kind of sorted out what was going on with her and found a teacher.
Yeah, that's one thing your website and similar ones do is it makes it possible for people who are out there on their own to really get a much more accurate and broad-based understanding of this whole thing. And that's a real service that helps a lot of people.
Yeah, and thank God for the technology that makes it possible. I mean, obviously there was a time not long ago when, as you said, back in the '60s, what do you do if you're interested in this stuff? Well, there's a few books, but it's hard to find anybody who knows what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And now it's kind of like spreading all over the place.
Oh, it's amazing. Just since the last 5, 6, 7 years, there's a explosion, and that's great. I think the only downside to it is, if there is one, is that I see people who have a, really in-depth intellectual understanding of it and can confuse that with the real knowing that's experiential and direct. And but that's okay.
Well, that's an interesting topic, actually. And I heard you just this morning. I was listening to you talking about some guy who pretty much memorized everything there was to know about Buddhism. And you mentioned another woman who actually had memorized everything that Adyashanti had ever said and felt like she could teach.
Right, right,
Yeah,
right, right.
yeah.
I
And it,
met her at the end of an Adyashanti retreat I went to. It's like, oh, wait, time out. This channeling Adyashanti is not the same as being him. And
yeah.
it's like,
It's a funny thing because I'm going to interview him in August, and I've listened to like over 5 days worth of his audios. I have it
mhm,
all on my iTunes. And yet, if you ask me to summarize what he says, I'd be at a loss for words. But actually, while I'm listening to him, it's like every single sentence is an aha.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's like it clicks.
He's great.
So yeah, but no, but let's continue on this point for a minute because this whole thing of people kind of, I think it's easy to get an intellectual or intuitive feel for this
Hmm.
because we're like fish in the ocean. We're surrounded by this water, and so if somebody starts reading these books or listening to these talks, they have this kind of aha thing of, yeah, I get it.
Hmm.
Non-duality, it makes sense
Hmm.
to me.
Hmm.
But I think there is a common syndrome these days of mistaking that initial sort of intuitive sense for the actual state of
Oh,
realization. And
I,
if a lot of these people were to somehow magically step into Ramana Maharshi's body and see through his eyes, they'd suddenly realize, whoa, this is much different than that initial sort of smell of it that I.
absolutely. It's so the real thing is so radically different and more, mm, I don't know, destabilizing, you might say, than it's just no. Yeah, you can read this stuff so much, and I have people I work with and I teach who do. They can quote Nisargadatta page and number, and they can refer to all these things I've never read. And when I was going through this process, I didn't read that much. In the Zen tradition, you're not really encouraged to read, and there wasn't that much available anyway, except original sources. And I didn't understand Wei Ning really, or you know, the fifth patriarch or something. So there wasn't much available, and you weren't encouraged to read. You're encouraged to experience directly for yourself. And now there's so much available that you can almost delude yourself into thinking you don't have to have the personal experience. You can intellectually grasp this stuff. And you can, but that is like, reading a menu and thinking you've had lunch.
Yeah,
It's not the same.
yeah, it's very good. I mean, it's really good to draw this distinction, I think, between experience and understanding. They're
Yeah.
not the same thing. I mean, I think there ultimately comes a point at which they merge,
Mm-hmm.
but prior to that point, and that could mean many, many years, they are two different things. And I think both are important.
Mm-hmm.
They supplement one
Yeah.
another.
I think for me, it was the intellectual understanding and the ability to describe it and put it into words came after the experience. And And the reading mostly came after. I started reading all these books because I was curious about how people expressed it. And until 2002, I didn't read hardly anything because
Mm.
I just didn't. And but now I'm fascinated by how different people express this, and you know, it's the intellectual understanding is very useful afterwards.
Yeah.
It's less useful beforehand. I think it's not. I mean, it's good to have accurate teaching. That's very helpful, but ultimately, you've got to have this inner transformation.
I think one of its main values beforehand is as just a sort of an inspiration or
Yeah,
you know, a carrot to follow for, it's like
that's right.
this sounds good. I should go for it.
I'd say that's what it was for me, is a sense of, this is possible for human beings, and it may even be possible for me, and it's worth taking seriously and, pursuing it. So it's like, good, that's worth doing.
Yeah. I mean, it was actually a Zen book which really got me going. I used to, back in my hippie drug days, I used to read Zen books. And one night I was sitting on my bed, and all my friends had gone home, and I was sitting there on LSD thinking, oh, here I am again in this
Mm.
weirdo state. And I picked up Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, and was reading this little book. And
Mhm,
it just hit me like a ton of bricks. I thought, these guys are really serious, and I'm just
mhm.
screwing around
Yeah,
here.
yeah,
And
yeah.
if I keep screwing around like this, I'm going to live a miserable life. So I thought, that's it. I'm going to stop drugs, learn
Right.
meditation, and so it was an inspiration.
That's great. That's great. And some of those nuggets stick in your mind. Things I heard in the Zen training I went through, like, well, show me your original face before your parents were born. Some of the koans are just some things I heard the teachers say, or things I read in books. I had no clue what they were. And I would now say even things I heard in church growing up, in the New
Yeah.
Testament, things that Jesus said. I had no idea what it was, but I think at some level it sticks in there and kind of rubs away and irritates and provokes. And I mean, you're not conscious of it, but so there's something to be said for hearing this stuff,
Hmm.
and just even if you don't have a clue what it's about, it seems like it goes deep inside for at least some people and just works on you.
Yeah. Kind of like a little bit of sand makes a
Yeah,
pearl.
yeah, yeah.
Huh.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, so it's been almost 10 years since 2002. Um, how would you say your life has changed, if any, in the last 9 years? Well, how is it different today than it was, just after that awakening?
Um,
And
you
maybe
know,
it's one of these yes/no answers where yes, it's different in this way, but no, it's absolutely the same in that way.
On the surface, it doesn't look that different.
Yeah.
I still am a psychologist. I still own an office building. I still am a parent, and I still have relationships, and I still work in the same building and live in the same location that I did when
Hmm.
this happened. Nothing changed on the surface in a way. I did start eventually trying to convey this stuff as a teacher or something, because I kept getting people wanting me to do that. So eventually that happened. But I would say it's more an inner process of continuous revelation. Just new realizations and new ways of seeing things just keep coming up.
Hmm.
And
Have there been any sort of mega realizations, or is it more like just little nuggets, just little gems that kind of reveal themselves throughout the day to day?
it's I would say both. I mean, just recently there's just a sense of, and some of it's very hard to even put into words, but one idea that just recently occurred is that there's everything is programming. Everything that we normally think and see, and I knew this, I mean, but you know it at different levels, you know it in different ways. It's all programming, and that none of it needs to be taken the least bit seriously. And I've been even saying this, but you see it in a deeper way sometimes. It just pops into your head, and it's so very clear. Um,
Can you
eh,
give us an example?
well, I would say there's a guy, Bart Marshall, who's a good friend in North Carolina, and Bart had an initial kind of glimpse when he got blown up in Vietnam by
Mm.
a mortar shell, and And then he was aware there were dead bodies around. He was aware these bodies were just rubber dummies.
Mm.
There's no animating force in them. And then that gradually over many, many years, he had a much deeper awakening after seeing Harding, I guess, the headless guy,
Douglas Harding, yeah.
Douglas Harding, and um, that we're all just rubber dummies. That's really all that's here is a programmed robot.
Mm.
Uh, it's just another way of saying, this is not to be taken that seriously.
Mm.
Whatever comes out of this mouth is mostly just programmed nonsense. But you know, and then it's just the way it is. But there's this other sense of a way of being in the world that is totally unconditioned, and so both are true.
Unconditioned, you say?
Unconditioned, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so this spontaneous, direct, free speaking and acting, it's called in Zen. It's called you call it Wu Wei, meaning acting without an actor, speaking without a speaker.
Hmm.
So you get different ways of seeing it. This underlying realization, I don't know that it changes or deepens, but the ability to articulate it and manifest it in the world and live it out in this body and be, more continuously present, that I think is a progressive thing
Yeah.
that, 20 years down the line, I expect will be much deeper than it is right now. So, I mean, this realization, this original face or this original seeing is what it is, but the ability to embody it and manifest it and especially articulate it and live it out is progressive, and it's a progressive deepening, and
Hmm.
um, you could say it's a progressive disappearing of anything to do with me. But
Uh-huh.
so there, that just continue. I've heard Adyashanti say this too. I haven't heard too many people say it, but there's just new realizations that occur all the time, and you realize, especially because I'm essentially teaching this all day, every day in my office.
Hmm.
Um, I just hear things come out of the mouth that I realize I couldn't have said not that long ago.
Yeah.
And that's cool. It's interesting. It's fun. And it's hard to articulate. It's hard to give you specific examples. Some of it is stuff that you just see more deeply. But all I can tell you is that it's a progressive thing that goes on forever, I guess, unless you really get sidetracked and lose all sense of what's real.
Yeah, or have some brain damage or
Yeah,
something,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah, 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 yeah,
You know.
yeah. Yeah, but my overt life looks pretty similar. I mean, I
Hmm.
don't know that I shaved my head at one point because I didn't have any hair anyway, so. But I mean,
Well,
it's just like, it's like nothing to do with spirituality. I guess another realization is I quit wanting to call it spiritual. This has nothing to do with spirituality, really. This is just seeing things as they are. I mean, why call it spiritual? So,
well, that's supposed. I think that's what the word is supposed to connote, but it just has so
I
much
know,
baggage, you
I
know.
know. I had people who always had trouble with that, and I don't have any problem with it. I came out of a spiritual tradition, and I'm very comfortable with it. But
Yeah.
it's
Well, if you're gonna use words, you want to use them to communicate, and if you're gonna use a word which is gonna confuse people because it has so many
yeah,
connotations
yeah,
that you don't intend, then you might as well
right.
find better words.
Yeah, right, right. It's gradual and progressive, and it's a progressive disappearing to everything you ever thought was you.
So the very essence of it, the core of the realization, you don't feel that that can be clarified or stabilized or anything. It just is what it is, or could it be?
No, I would say both. It is what it is, but there's no doubt it gets stabilized, clarified, deepened, embodied, manifest. The deepening is the embodiment and
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
manifestation of it.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not a big fan of pure non-duality, where I call it the cave of non-duality, where people just sort of have a non-dual realization and sit there. I don't mean to sound overly negative about it, but that's important. But you have to bring this awareness into the world and live it
Hmm.
out in daily life and express it behaviorally and verbally and in ways that people can understand and appreciate, and that's part of it.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is a kind of a perennial theme in these interviews because I keep hitting on that point. You know, where
Mhm.
people just sort of they glom onto the absolute view, and then just tend to
Right,
dismiss all the
right,
relative considerations, you know.
right. You can't, I mean, of course, in Zen, being a Mahayana Buddhist tradition, I mean, there's part of the training program, it's like, and this is maybe a slight concern is that people have these non-dual realizations and think they've got it, but if you're in a tradition or you have a teacher of some kind, you realize, okay, that's great, but what's next? And it's embodiment. It's bringing the non-dual into the dual,
Yeah.
and to the point eventually they both disappear, and then there's just this. But these are like you could say stages of enlightenment or awakening that people say there are no stages. I don't understand that. Of course there's stages. There's degrees of depth, and mainly what that means is the ability to embody and manifest it.
I
So,
think again they're speaking from the absolute view when they
right.
say there are no stages. On some
I,
level, that's true,
yeah, that's true at one
you
level.
know. But if
I,
that's,
I
but you
understand.
gotta, yeah.
But still, it's like in the 10 ox herding pictures. I don't
I
know,
was just gonna mention those actually.
and it's only in the last X number of years that I've had a sense of this 10th picture, walking through the marketplace, bare-chested, mud-caked, this guy, this just here. But he's in the marketplace. He's not in a cave. He's not dwelling in bliss. He's alive and well in the presence of other beings and making some kind of mark and impact and just acting freely undisturbed.
Hmm.
And it has to be brought into the world. That's it.
Yeah. You've been talking about how, the embodiment and the evolution of it is seen in terms of ability to express it,
Hmm.
which is to a certain extent an intellectual verbal kind of thing.
Hmm.
How about other dimensions such as emotional or perceptual? I mean,
Hmm.
how have those been growing, if at all, in your life?
Yeah, I would say one of the main area of growth there is in relationships,
Hmm.
and primary romantic relationships, like with a woman, where, you know, um, old patterns that I really didn't think would still be there or still come up do sometimes come up. Feeling, taking something personally, getting hurt, feeling not valued. I mean, it's hard to say it with a straight face, but it feels very real at the time.
Yeah.
So, there's something very valuable. I mean, a relationship can be a real practice if you take it seriously and are willing to not get totally lost in your own reactions and not blame your reactions on somebody else, but just see it as your own conditioning that just some of it is very deep and very hard to get at unless you're very intimately connected with another human being, and the people who you might say trigger this stuff in me, I value because I wouldn't see it otherwise. It wouldn't
Hmm.
come up.
Yeah.
So if you had a very, say, pleasant, comfortable relationship or job or, there's a lot of nice things about that, but on the other hand, you may not become aware of some very rough edges in you that are still there and wouldn't get activated without somebody challenging you or pushing you or
Yeah.
so.
Did you ever read Carlos Castaneda's books?
Mhm. Sure.
Remember the petty tyrant
Yeah.
theme? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I don't get the idea that any of us ever get beyond this stuff completely. I don't think that's realistic. I think the goal is to embrace this and welcome these challenges that come along. It can be physical health, although I've been healthy. It could be chronic pain. For me, it seems like it's been relationships. It's also running and owning a business, and
Hmm.
um, a lot of psychotherapists don't like to be business people, but it's always been interesting to me, and I do that. I own a big building, and it's been a real interesting challenge to learn to deal with people in outside of a therapeutic context, who challenge me and push me and provoke me, and notice how undisturbed mostly I am, and how much more skillful and automatic and easy it is to just deal with things that I know I could not possibly have done in the past. I see this also in terms of, honestly, electronic gadgets, just like in software. I wouldn't have even tried to do things like this 10 years ago. now I enjoy the challenge of just, just being present, actually reading the directions, do- doing what it says to do,
Yeah.
not feeling like I should know how to do it because I'm just so bright or something without reading the directions, just surrendering to what is real moment to moment. And cooking, I never tried to cook before, and things that, I just avoided in life. I didn't realize it maybe, but I now see that I just avoided, repairs, home repairs,
Hmm.
like stuff I just go and do. I read the directions, I follow them, and I do it. I would never have done that stuff 10 years ago.
That's cool. I'm glad I asked you that question because I don't hear people say this kind of thing too often, and I think it's very useful for people to hear.
Hmm.
That as a because sometimes you actually have the impression of spiritual people, so to speak, or awakened people that they're going to become more otherworldly, less involved
Hmm.
in some way. They're going to have to simplify their life. And can't deal with a lot of stuff, and what you're saying is just the opposite, which I think
Oh,
is
yeah.
kind of a breath of fresh air.
Just the opposite for me. It's like, and I know people going through that kind of stage that you described, but you want to keep going through that and past that. And I mean, this is the embodiment. This is the manifestation.
Yeah.
I
Well, and
see
actually, as you
something.
say, it is a stage, and I shouldn't belittle it because it might be a very important stage
Right.
for a certain person to just really chill for a while and not
Hmm.
have a lot coming at them.
Right.
I think there is a value to monastic life, for
Right.
instance.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
But eventually you want to keep going, so to speak, further, just keep at it. And what then happens is I think a vastly more comfortable and skillful and enjoyable interaction with everything.
mhm.
Everything that happens, and you don't need to avoid anything. It's like everything is just this.
Yeah, there's another verse in the Gita which is yoga sta kuru karmani, which means established in being, or yoga, perform action. And obviously in the context of that, Arjuna is being asked to go out and fight a battle, which is a pretty challenging situation. But
Hmm.
but he's being told first to get established in the absolute or in the self. Or,
Hmm. Yes, and then bring this understanding into the world.
yeah.
Manifest it in this body and this mind, helping people who are suffering, having compassion, doing what you can do.
Hmm.
Um,
What's your sense of God? What's your feeling of for God, or who God is, or what God is, or your orientation to God?
well, God is a word I would never have used until 2002, and then I was totally comfortable with God. God is, I mean, as I understand it, it's not an entity. It's nothing outside of you or me or this. You could say it's the same thing as mind with a capital M or no mind or um, it's all that is and all that isn't. And any definition, description, quality is not it. And so normally you hear people talk about God, and what they're talking about is their projections, their programming, their conditioned beliefs, and the idea that God has opinions or
Right. God,
feelings or
God hates homosexuals
you're
or whatever.
right, or would vote for somebody. It's beyond belief. It's hysterically funny to me. It's like uh, God is not a registered anything. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh,
So
that's funny.
anything you say about it isn't it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I sort of think of God as just, I mean, whatever you look at, from the, you know, Hubble telescope photos down to microscopic things, there's like this fascinating intelligence that seems to
Hmm.
be
Yeah.
governing everything,
Yeah.
expressed in everything. It's like so amazing the way everything works. I mean, look at the eye of a fly and how that works, and
Hmm.
that didn't just happen through a bunch of billiard balls,
Hmm.
running into each other randomly.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
I'm very comfortable with that kind of thinking. It's almost like there's something that cannot be described that is animating everything.
yeah,
And you are that.
exactly, which is what makes it a relevant point and not just an interesting philosophical thing,
Right,
is that
right.
if you are that, how deeply can you know that you are that or
Yes.
experience that you are that, how fully, you know.
Right.
And we see some of these really great saints who seem to be, they say, God realized, you know, who've merged with God so fully and so consciously. That's an interesting kind of point on the horizon that, you know, we might be
Yeah,
progressing.
I just like to see them have a job.
Yeah, well, some of them have, some of them bear pretty. Yeah, some of them
Yeah.
don't, like Ananda Maima or whatever, who
And
practically
I don't
had to be fed, you know. But some of them bear fairly heavy burdens of responsibility.
right, right. So I just I like the integration of this awareness into ordinary life. Yeah,
Hmm.
daily life is the way, you know.
Yeah,
Being ordinary is our true nature, you know, and nothing special, nothing different or outside, just this as it is, being yourself, you know.
yeah, true. And I mean, obviously, what you're implying is that some of the people I've just alluded to have been kind of glorified and deified, and
I
uh,
don't know, but maybe, but it's like, yeah, for all of us, like ordinary people, living your real life with presence and gratitude and just here, just now, feeding the kids, you know,
mhm.
cleaning up the dishes, you know, running errands. But there's a way of doing all these things that reveals, you might say, the presence of God in all of it.
Yep,
And that's an inner perceptual shift that allows for that to happen. This is it. This is heaven on earth right here, right now, just like it is. And seeing this and living it and manifesting and embodying it and then interacting with everything, you know, is the way, I think.
yeah.
Daily life.
Have you noticed a big improvement in your effectiveness with your clients?
Oh yeah.
I guess you call them clients.
Yeah, clients, yeah.
Since your shift, I mean,
It's huge.
and actually, has your practice become a lot more popular because word of mouth? Hey, this Michael guy really has a has an effect.
Yeah, I mean, I was all, but I look back on that and I say, I've seen people, I have both friends and clients I've seen long before and long after this shift. And some of them point out there's a lot more continuity than I would see. To me, it seemed very discontinuous before and after.
I mean,
But
you seem like the same guy basically.
yeah, I was saying
Yeah.
similar things, but I had these awakening things and going back to the early 80s. So I think the shift in a behavioral sense was much more gradual. It
Yeah.
seemed internally like a radical before and after in 2002, but I think it was integrating and processing and manifesting slowly during that whole period of time. Um, but yeah, I'd say I sense I'm vastly more effective as a therapist. But I always felt like I was pretty effective, and I never had an opening in private practice, and um, basically still haven't taken hardly any new people unless they're deeply immersed in this spiritual path, then I will see them because
Yeah.
I like, and I'd say the therapy I do, although I still see people, I never talk about spiritual anything or awakening or anything, and but the way I can see their problems and help them with it is deeply affected by this awakening thing that I've gone through and the ability to teach aspects of it that are liberating to people, like to not take things personally, for example, and
Yeah.
stuff
Like you're
like that.
functioning from a subtler level, sort of.
It seems like you just see what's in front of you.
Yeah.
You're not like you talked about earlier today. You're not occluded. It's just what is in front of you is just revealed. It's
Hmm.
obvious. It just jumps out at you. So that makes you
No longer through a glass darkly.
right, right. And so I don't have ideas about how to treat people. I just interact with them, and what needs to happen pretty much happens of its own. But yeah, it's vastly more enjoyable, less difficult.
Do you find it more enjoyable to deal with the people who, really have a spiritual, so there's that word again, but that kind of inclination,
Yeah, yeah.
as compared with the people who are just kind of totally messed up and not
Yeah,
really interested in this kind
you
of thing?
know, it's very funny. I mean, Binghamton, where I live, is an old manufacturing town that's been on hard economic times, and there's a lot of people here who've never heard of Buddhism or meditation or anything else, and I've seen a lot of them. And in other words, they don't have any preconceptions. Their glass is totally empty. I pour
Hmm.
something in, and they get it.
Hmm.
They're transformed. And
Wow.
It's almost like the
Just through
less.
talking to you. You don't send them home with prescriptions to try
No.
this or do that. You
Well, I
just
just tell them. I just tell them the truth, and
yeah.
because they don't come in with all these ideas, about what Nisargadatta said and so forth, then they can be transformed sometimes like that.
Hmm.
It's like amazing. And then some of the most difficult, recalcitrant, stubborn, and in a way hopeless people I've ever dealt with are the ones who are convinced they know everything about spirituality.
Yeah.
And I feel like I just have to beat them senseless to get them to stop doing that. And,
Yeah.
sometimes they're willing, sometimes they're not. But so it's unpredictable. Yeah,
Hmm.
so people who have heard me talk and like what they heard me say, those are good people I like to work with.
Yeah.
But, the people who've been steeped in some version of spirituality, and I get those too for 30 years, um, and just have a whole bunch of beliefs and convictions and ideas based on what they read and intellectually understood, I'd rather take a bricklayer,
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
farmer, and start from scratch.
Maybe it wasn't a coincidence that most of Christ's disciples were like fishermen and
I,
things.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
right. He didn't get the intelligentsia.
Yeah.
He got the outcasts, the people who had nothing and were both probably somewhat desperate and totally open.
Hmm.
It's very, very interesting. People who get it are sometimes not the ones you would think.
Yeah. Do you ever deal with professionally with people over the phone or Skype, or just
Yeah,
in your office?
both. Yeah, I do Skype. I've had people around the world who I Skype with, and I've always done some phone work, and I
Hmm.
see people in my office, and you know, I've done a lot of teaching in Binghamton and around Ithaca and other areas in New
Hmm.
York and around the country, but now I'm trying to downsize. I'm trying to, reduce the size of my practice and eventually liberate some time and energy because, I've nearly finished a book I want to publish, and there's a lot of teaching stuff I want to do, a lot of writing I want to do, and um,
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you that, whether if you could do so, you would actually just, not have a practice and just devote yourself fully to writing and doing satsangs and stuff like that.
well, yes and no. I mean, I haven't done that, so therefore I wouldn't do it, I
Yeah,
think you do it when it's right, but and the teaching in my office has been invaluable to me in learning how to convey it.
right.
I mean, it's just been a wonderful learning experience in terms of, what works, what doesn't work, how to convey it, how to get it across to people. So it's like I feel like my ability to convey it has been infinitely deepened by just staying in my office and trying to communicate with ordinary people about this awareness.
Hmm.
So, but I also feel like that's coming to an end.
Hmm.
That's been a very valuable process, but I feel like at this point I need to do more like maybe what Scott Kelby is doing or
Yeah.
other people who,
Well, he's a lawyer. He spends most of his day practicing law,
well, I didn't even know that, but it's like
Yeah,
there's nothing wrong with living your real life exactly as it is. And for me, it's been easy to bring this awareness into my work because I do psychotherapy, and so I want to convey to other therapists and to just ordinary people, the realizations that come out of I call it applied awareness, like, when you see duality from the aspect of non-duality, what does that look like in daily life, and how do you live your life in a way that's more skillful and less stressful and, and is more enjoyable for everyone?
hmm,
And that can be taught. I mean, I do this all the time, so I want to spend more time trying to convey this to a broader audience because I just think it's just very useful. And yeah,
yeah.
if I were an artist, I mean, it would be manifesting in my art. If I
Hmm.
were a motorcycle racer, it'd come out there. But, I'm a psychologist, so it comes out that way.
Yeah, no, it's a blessing. I mean, I think it's really cool that you have a profession that segues so nicely with,
Hmm. Yeah,
with your passion.
it's very natural, very
Yeah.
natural. And then, when I've gone to retreats like with Adyashanti or I hear, I look at Eckhart Tolle's DVDs. I mean, the questions people ask these guys are always, or Byron Katie, they're always deeply personal, emotional, psychological type questions.
Yeah.
How do I deal with depression? How do I deal with chronic pain? I have rage reactions or I have addictions or, I mean, it's always what comes up.
Mm.
This is the real hunger in the world, and so this can be addressed.
Huh. Maybe the whole world is going through a dark night of the soul right now, and
Well,
that's
that's a
why.
good, yeah, that's a good way of saying it.
Yeah.
I think that's a very useful perspective.
Yeah. I mean, there does seem to be a quickening, of awakening
Mm.
and all, and I think correspondingly, there's a lot of stuff happening.
Yeah, there's a
I
lot
mean,
of
there's always been a lot of stuff happening. World War II and World War One were no picnic,
right.
but there does seem to be some intensification or acceleration going on these days.
I had a hard time. I didn't know for sure if I bought that for a long time. I
Mm.
had people tell me that, and I heard people say it that I trusted, and now I see. I do believe that. I think that's absolutely real. I get emails all the time from people all over the world who have clearly had some kind of awakening experience and don't know what is next or what to do.
Yeah.
And I don't know that this was always happening. I doubt it. I don't think so.
I think it's accelerating as far as
Yeah.
I can tell. I mean, neither of us is in a position to say,
Yeah,
statistically or scientifically, but it sure seems that way.
I think so. I'm beginning to think
Yeah.
so. And the earth changes are very interesting and
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. Which, is all cause for optimism, and as far as, where the planet is headed. Maybe all these predictions of a new age and so on will
mhm.
pan out.
Well, I think people have to grasp that there's a deconstruction process that has to go on, and it can look kind of messy on the outside and feel pretty messy inside.
Hmm.
Suzanne Siegel being one example of it, but
Yeah.
there are many, and yeah, that doesn't have to be a bad thing, although it can certainly be confusing, and it can be very helpful to either be part of a tradition and a community or to have someone you can talk to or read who can help you navigate that
Hmm.
and not just freak out. So,
There's a term in physics called phase transition, where a thing goes from one state to another
right,
state, and
right.
on the junction point of the transition, there's a lot of turbulence that
Yeah,
takes place, and then it kind of smooths out again.
that's a great phrase. I avoided physics my whole life, and it's one of those things I always avoided, and I might be able to do now. But that's a great term. There was a book I read in graduate school called The Structure of Scientific
Oh yeah,
Revolutions by
Thomas Kuhn. I read
Thomas.
that. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful book. And he talked about paradigm shifts
Right.
and normal science and extraordinary science. And, I think in a way you could say this is a paradigm shift or just
Mm.
a completely different way of seeing things.
Big one.
A big one, yeah.
Yeah. Huh. Well, I suppose another way of looking at it is if we think of, you know, like you said earlier, when the guy in Vietnam, the people died, and we're all just rubber dummies.
Hmm.
If we think of ourselves as sort of being cells in a larger body, the body of humanity, collective consciousness, then all these cells are kind of waking up, and
Hmm.
that would perhaps suggest that the whole body is waking up, as so many
Right,
of its cells do.
right. And the body is everything.
Yeah.
The,
And I mean, there are also examples in science of where a real small percentage of a system governs or influences the whole system in a very pivotal sort of way. Like about 1% of the cells in the heart are called the pacemaker cells, and they regulate the beating of the whole heart. So,
mm-hmm.
even a small, I think it was Margaret Mead or somebody that said that, big changes always happen with a very small group of committed people.
Hmm.
And the fact that more and more people seem to be undergoing this awakening could really have a pivotal effect on the whole.
I do think that. I had this awareness that just popped into my head after this happened to me that every human being who somehow goes through this awakening makes it a little bit easier for everyone else.
Yeah.
And that's, the Buddha himself said, is supposedly when I awakened, all beings awakened with me.
Hmm.
And of course, when Jesus says, I forgive the sins of the world. And
Hmm.
these are similar awarenesses that somehow, I mean, no, we're so interconnected. We're the same. Are one. We're one thing and one beating, pulsing,
Organism,
organism. And
or like a big jellyfish.
yeah, yeah. When any one person gets a little bit more of a ability to see what's real, it does in some way make it a little bit easier for everyone else. And if that's happening all over the place, that's a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, there's also that 100th monkey story. You've probably heard that one, right?
Hmm.
A certain number of monkeys start washing their coconuts on some other island, and
Right.
as soon as it reaches a certain critical mass, then all the monkeys on completely unconnected
Right.
islands
Right. Right.
learn the same trick, you know?
Yeah, there's some energetic something resonance that goes on that's very,
Yeah,
yeah, very powerful.
yeah. Cool. Well, we could probably keep going on like this all day, but is there anything that, has been sort of in the back of your mind or that you customarily like to say to people that we haven't touched upon?
Yeah, when you ask that question, what occurs is I feel like saying to people, have faith in your ability to realize this truth directly for yourself. It's inherent. We all are this, and just, it's worth it. And that's it. Keep pushing. Listening to talks like this and reading the books, well, some of the books you mentioned on your website. I bought two of the books you you have on your website that I hadn't read,
Uh-huh.
like the one by Donna Gorell, especially
Oh,
Perfect
right, yeah.
Madness, and
Interesting, huh?
a very interesting book. And I mean, just continuing to expose yourself to this kind of stuff loosens things up. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, there's a saying, that to which you give your attention grows stronger in your life. And
Hmm.
that's actually one thing I liked about what I was hearing you, when I was listening to your talks during the week. You were saying how, you can kind of, fan the flames.
Hmm.
What was those things? Bellows, they call them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You can fan you can brighten the fire, or
Right,
you can be throwing water on it, and
right,
dampen it. But it
right.
definitely makes a difference if you put your
Absolutely.
attention in this area.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Good. Yes. Have faith that you can manifest and live this and realize this in this body in this lifetime and do what you can that makes sense to you to do that.
And it doesn't matter your age or anything. I mean, when Adyashanti was here a month ago, a guy got up to the microphone and he practically had tears in his eyes because he had heard Osho say something about how you really have to get this at a young age or you're not going to get it at all because you could become too set in your ways later on.
Mm.
And Adyashanti's answer was, well, I totally disagree with that. I've seen
No,
so many examples to the contrary. So it
absolutely.
doesn't matter.
No, I mean, I've heard American teachers now deceased say, if you don't get it by your mid-30s, you're not going to get it. Not true. I mean,
Yeah.
this happened to me when I was 56 or something, and age has nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
Anyone at any moment, it's just a ceasing, and it can happen to anyone. If you're alive and your nervous system is relatively intact, and maybe if it isn't,
Yeah.
it can it can and does happen.
Yep. Good. Well, good. So that's an optimistic note to end on, I suppose. So thanks, Michael. This has been
Thank
great.
you. It's been fun. I enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, me too. So let me just wrap up by telling people that you've been listening to an interview with Michael Hall on Buddha at the Gas Pump. Depending on you may not have discovered batgap.com, which is an acronym for Buddha at the Gas Pump. That's BATGAP. But if not, go there and you'll see all the interviews I've done archived, as well as ones that I have, continue to do. And you can sign up for an email notification. Every time I put up a new one, you'll get an email. There's a discussion group there where people get into big debates over all these things. You can get into that if you want to. And there's also a podcast. Some people don't like to sit in front of their computers, but they listen while they commute and things like that. So you can click on a link and get a podcast and put it on your iPod. So that's it. Next week, next interview is with a very fascinating gentleman named Radhanath Swami, who has written a book called The Journey Home, which I read back in January, and I loved it so much I've been telling people about it ever since. It almost eclipses Autobiography of a Yogi in terms of being a fascinating story of a person's spiritual adventure. So that'll be the next interview, and we will see you then. Thanks for listening.